Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Andy. It's a great pleasure to be here. I assumed when I was asked if I would talk at these lectures that I would be asked to talk about, I don't know, anti-nuclear campaigning or about the foundation of the West Wales Eco Centre, which was 30 years ago, or even about campaigning against GM crops or whatever. But no, they wanted me to talk about Stonehenge. Now, it's either very foolish or very inspired, I'm not quite sure. But it actually slots in quite nicely, actually, with some of the things that Steve has been saying, because he's been talking about the interactions, if you like, between architecture and building, the techniques of building. And I've always been very interested in Stonehenge. Not as a historian, but really as a geographer, as somebody interested in glaciology. And I'll explain in a few moments as to what that's all about. But Stonehenge, first of all, how many people have been to Stonehenge? I bet everybody has, more or less. No, not everybody. Okay. Well, Stonehenge is clearly one of the great icons of the world. It's a brand to die for, isn't it? Thinking it's a pity that Steve has gone, because I'm sure that if Stonehenge hadn't been invented, Steve would have invented it by now. Because it's a dream, a marketing dream, actually. It is such an iconic structure, and everybody thinks that they know quite a lot about Stonehenge because it's been a part of our culture. Ever since we were very, very small. So I want to just take this question of what do we think we know about Stonehenge? We think we know a great deal about it, actually. We're probably all very familiar with the idea that Stonehenge is carefully and rather beautifully engineered, that it was a pretty immaculate structure when it was finished, that it was carefully designed through a series of phases, that it evolved in an organic sort of way, but which was nevertheless very, very carefully planned. And we see it, if you like, as one of the high points of prehistoric culture. One of the things that people are continuously gobsmacked about, the very idea that Stonehenge was thought up and created. So we think we know quite a lot about it. Let's just take a few of these things that we think we know and just check them out a little bit. First of all, Neolithic mathematics. Let's just look at some of the things that we think we know about the alignments, the mechanics, the design, the engineering of Stonehenge. Well, we're all used to seeing models like this, aren't we? The one on the left there. This incredible creation of standing stones with lintels on top of them, with trilithons, with circles and alignments and arrangements of smaller stones, creating this structure that is so iconic that people have copied it all over the world, and it appears in virtually every textbook about prehistoric structural engineering or the creation of prehistoric buildings. And it's rather interesting that when you actually start looking at Stonehenge in a little bit more detail, you discover quite quickly that actually none of this is quite true. The alignments are actually all slightly off. They're all off by a degree or two. The straight lines are all a bit bent. The spacing between the stones is not actually what we would like it to be. The shape and size of the stones is actually, again, not quite what we would like them to be. The circles are not even circular. The circles are actually rather wonky. And so Stonehenge, when we start looking at the Neolithics and looking at the way in which Stonehenge has been promoted as an astronomical observatory, if we go back to people like Hawkins and Alexander Thom, we're all quite familiar with these names, the people who first of all flagged up the fact that Stonehenge was indeed an astronomical observatory, very, very carefully engineered in precisely the right location in order to predict for us the summer solstice or the setting of the sun on the midwinter solstice or whatever, a whole range of other astronomical events as well. And we discover that actually none of this quite works out as it should. And it's interesting to me that in the last 10, 15 years, the textbooks on Stonehenge, the archaeologists themselves are mentioning this sort of thing less and less, because increasingly they're discovering that actually none of these alignments are quite as right as they should be. And we can extend this rather crucial examination of the facts about Stonehenge if we look at the sarsen stones. Now, these are the big stones, the big standing stones, some of which have got lintels across them, and others are freestanding. But the idea is that the great majority of them did at one time support lintels. And we have to ask this question, actually, are they very carefully chosen for purpose? Are they fit for purpose? And when we look at them in detail, we discover actually that they're a pretty grotty collection of stones of all shapes and sizes. Some of them are very, very rough indeed, and they're so rough that they're on the point of falling to pieces. And if you just look at these slides, you'll see you've got the heel stone down here. You've got stone number 11, which is leaning at a crazy angle, but it's much, much smaller than it ought to be. And all of the others are full of great rough irregularities. Now, some of them are indeed fit for purpose. Maybe 5, 6 of the stones, of the big stones at Stonehenge, they're beautifully shaped, they've been worked, they've been very carefully chosen to be placed in a particular position. But actually, we do need to ask this little question: are these stones quite as carefully chosen and quite as accurately placed as the archaeologists would like them to be? We can extend the same sort of analysis to the bluestone quarry, or to the bluestones. Now, these are the smaller stones. Most of them stand about this high. Some of them are a bit shorter. Some of them are a little bit taller. Many of them have fallen over, or they're sort of lying in the ground. And the idea that is contained within all of the literature on Stonehenge is that the bluestones were taken from a bluestone quarry. Now, this bluestone quarry is supposedly up on the Preseli Hills. If you drive from here towards Fishguard and Newport on the coast road, you will see on the skyline these craggy rocks, and these are indeed the rocks of Carnminy. And Carnminy is supposed to be the place where the Neolithic tribesmen who built Stonehenge came along and quarried the stones, or collected the stones from a particular quarrying area for whatever reason, and carried them all the way from here to Stonehenge. Now, that was the story that was put out initially by a chap called Herbert Thomas immediately after the First World War, around about 1920. And it was very much developed by a very famous archaeologist called Richard Atkinson, who really created the present-day myth of Stonehenge. He developed the idea very strongly that indeed Carnminy was chosen as the source for these stones because they had some special quality about them, and that therefore this particular location was targeted by the builders of Stonehenge, because this is where they could get precisely the right raw materials for this wonderful building project that they had. Now, that's all very well, and it's still, unfortunately, contained within the English heritage literature, within all the tourist guides and everything else. If you start looking at the bluestones in a little bit more detail, unfortunately, the reality is a bit more prosaic and a bit more complicated, as is often the way. Now, at the moment, the geologists who've been working on the stones at Stonehenge, and indeed on the fragments of stones that have been found in the Stonehenge neighbourhood, in the Cursus and around Amesbury and various other places as well, in the general neighbourhood of Stonehenge, we're up to about 30 different locations now. And it is fairly clear that although some of the stones have indeed come from the Carnminy area, other stones have come from near Newport. There's a picture there of one of the locations very close to Newport on the side of Carningley. There's another stone that's come from quite close to Dinas on the North Pembrokeshire coast. Another stone has come from near Brynberion, again, which is not very far from here. And there are various other locations as well on the North Pembrokeshire coast, and indeed in various parts of the Preselis, where they're now pretty certain that these, again, are locations for some of the bluestones that have ended up at Stonehenge. So the truth is a great deal more complex, and indeed this is always the way with science, than we were originally led to believe. Now, one of the great myths, again, of Stonehenge is the bluestone transport myth. Again, this is solidly built into all the literature we read about Stonehenge, that that indeed that once the key location for these highly desirable stones had been worked out by the builders of Stonehenge, they set in motion a series of transport expeditions which involved people traveling to the key location in the Preseli Hills, as you can see on the map there, and which then gave them the place where they needed the stones. They then set up these expeditions, and they carried goodness knows how many stones, at least 80 is the usual story, from that location back to Stonehenge. And there has been an endless amount of extraordinary brain power devoted to this question of how these little stones, it's the small stones on the slides, how these little stones got from A to B, from the Preselis to Stonehenge. And some people think that they were carried around the coast. Various routes have been suggested. The short route is simply round the Pembrokeshire coast, up the Bristol Channel, and then up the Bristol Avon towards Stonehenge. Some people think that the stones were carried by curraghs or rafts or whatever, all the way around the coasts of Devon and Cornwall, all the way along the south coast, and then they were carried up the Hampshire Avon through to Stonehenge that way. And various other people more recently have suggested another route, and that is an inland route, which didn't involve any coastal transport at all, but which involved carrying the stones over dry land for almost the whole of the way from the Preselis to Stonehenge. Now, this is wonderful stuff, except that there's never been any evidence in favour of it. There's not a single scrap of evidence that any of this actually happened. And in 10 years ago, I had the great pleasure of taking part in the Millennium Stone project, which some people in this room might remember. Well, and the attempt was made to carry one single bluestone from the Preselis all the way to Stonehenge by using the techniques that would have been appropriate for the time. And so they started off wanting to pull this stone along on across the ground. They discovered that it was a bit too muddy on the ground, so actually they decided then that they'd pull the stone along roadways instead, nice asphalt surfaces. They discovered there was too much friction doing that, so they brought in low friction nylon netting in order to pull the stone along on that. And then they evolved a sort of raft, which would make life a little bit easier. And then they got the stone down to the shore of Milford Haven, at a place called Blackpool Mill, and it was then going to be put on these two wonderful curraghs, which was going to transport the stone from this point on right through to up to the Bristol Avon, fairly close to Stonehenge. They had all sorts of problems with getting the stone onto the curraghs. They had to use a high-lift crane with a long arm, and also a JCB and various other mechanical devices to get the stone onto the curraghs. They then found it was so unstable that they couldn't actually manage it at all. So eventually they slung the stone beneath the curraghs on a sling, which was a cunning plan to minimize the weight of the stone and to stabilize the whole thing. And they eventually managed to get a few hundred yards offshore in Milford Haven. As soon as they started to hit a little swell, the cradle slipped out of its position and the stone ended up on the floor of Milford Haven. And that picture on the left there is a picture of the Royal Navy rescuing the stone off the floor of Milford Haven. So the stone stood for several years in Milford Docks, and it now stands in glorious isolation in the National Botanic Gardens, in quite close to Carmarthen, if any of you wants to go and see it there. But there it is on its little sledge, and a lot of people took a lot of time and got a lot of fun out of this particular project. But for me and for many other people, it demonstrated pretty clearly, I think, that this so-called stone collecting project, which is supposed to have taken place about 5,000 years ago, would have been incredibly difficult, if not actually impossible. One doesn't like to use the word impossible, but it was certainly a very difficult project, and would have been infinitely more difficult if we had gone back to the heavily forested, marshy, wet, jungle sort of environment that we would have been talking about at the time. Now, it's interesting enough that this story of the human transport was proposed originally by this guy, Herbert Thomas, who was a Welshman, in about 1919 or 1920. It's interesting that although he was a geologist, he entirely dismissed an idea that had been around for much longer than that, going back to the late 1800s. The early geologists who had actually examined South Wales had all come to the view that South Wales had been glaciated by a very big glacier that had actually come in from the sea, come in from the Irish Sea, and had actually flowed across Pembrokeshire, across the South Wales coastlands, up the Bristol Channel, and onto the shore of Bristol and the Somerset levels, the coast of Somerset. And for some reason, Thomas absolutely refused to believe this. He said it would have been impossible for these stones to have been transported by ice. And therefore, he invented the myth of the human transport of the stones. And since then, of course, this myth has remained solidly in place as a part of, effectively a part of British history. And now, in more recent years, now that we understand a bit more about the way that ice has behaved, there's been a lot of research done, and where the ice limits are. The map on the left there shows, as accurately as we can, what we think the directions of ice movement have been, where the ice limit was located, more or less. This is now being examined in a great deal of detail in computer modeling. And there's a group in Aberystwyth University who are making very sophisticated models now, reconstructing the GBG, which is the greatest British glaciation limit. And the map on the left there is their latest attempt at indicating how far this ice might have reached. And as you can see, Salisbury Plain is totally covered by ice in this reconstruction. There's a lot of work still to be done on this, and I wouldn't pretend for a moment that all of these problems are solved, that we've got all the answers to this. But I think if we try to imagine what Somerset and the Mendips and that sort of area might have looked like 450,000 years ago, it would have looked something like this. I think this is a reasonable attempt at a reconstruction. This is actually the edge of the Greenland ice sheet, but it would have looked something like this. A few other questions as well. How many stones are there? How many stones should there be? Well, if we start looking at this again, we start to come up with some rather complicated answers. There should be 82 SARSENS on the site, and there should be about 82 bluestones on the site, if we believe these immaculate reconstructions that we're all brought up to love and to revere. And if we look at the SARSENS, we discover that there are actually, at the most, 51 SARSENS on the site. 31 of them are missing. There should be about 82 bluestones, and as far as we know, there are 43. That means 39 of those are missing, if we are to believe these wonderful reconstructions. So this gives us a grand total of 94 stones that we know about, and 70 stones that are entirely missing. There is no trace of them whatsoever. And we know that in the past, people have quarried Stonehenge. There are records that people used to go to Stonehenge to collect stones to build their gatepost. And there are stories about people smashing up the stones so that they could go away and use them for this, that, and the other. But we do have to ask the question, could this sort of activity, this small-scale exploitation of Stonehenge as a stone resource, could this sort of activity have removed 70 stones? And so, again, we have this fundamental question, were these stones ever there in the first place? So that brings us to this next question, was Stonehenge ever finished? Now, I'm pretty convinced that it never was. All of our actual images that we have of Stonehenge from the very earliest days suggest that it was a pretty shambolic old ruin. And the earliest images that we have go back to the 16th century. They were images that were created by people that had clearly never been near the place. If you look at this snow-covered mountain up here, and the castle and the wonderful mountainous terrain all around us, the guy who painted that particular painting had never been anywhere near Stonehenge. That was fairly clear. But if we look at as many of these ancient reconstructions as we can possibly find, we find that Stonehenge appears, sadly, always to have been a bit of a ruin, and that there is nothing that gives us any indication that ever was a wonderful, immaculate, completed monument of the type that that we're told so often is a key part of our heritage and our history. So I take the view on the basis of as much of the evidence as I can get at that Stonehenge was always a ruin, that it was never finished, and that it is actually an archetypal example of a project which had incredible aspirations. It may have had a wonderful architect, it may have had a visionary who was behind the whole thing, or maybe a visionary family or a visionary group of rulers who had a vision as to what they wanted, but they never managed to get the raw materials that they wanted, and they just couldn't get the workers. They simply, the whole project ran out of steam. And I suspect that in the end, after decades, even centuries of indecision, when they moved stones around from one position to another, they were never very clear, apparently, as to what they wanted to do. Maybe they weren't all that clear as to why they wanted to do it. There's always the intriguing possibility that the whole thing might just have been a folly. It might just have been a mad fantasy that somebody had as a piece of self-glorification or whatever. And that Stonehenge eventually, the whole project, they simply gave up on it and walked away from it. Now, the archaeologists don't like people to say this sort of thing, and so I'm quite prepared to come in for a lot of stick, as I have received already from the archaeological establishment. They don't like people questioning some of these fundamental assumptions as to what Stonehenge was, how it was built, what it looked like, etc. But if we look at these fictions that I've been running through, just put them up on the screen there, was it a wonder of the ancient world? We don't have a clue. It probably wasn't. That's the way the evidence seems to point. Was it made up of all these Sarsens? No, the facts don't support that. Did the Sarsens come from Overton Down in the Vale of Pewsey? Probably not. I suspect very strongly they were simply picked up in the immediate neighbourhood around Stonehenge. Did the bluestones, were they mostly made of spotted dolerite? That's wrong. Is there a bluestone quarry at Carnminey? No, I can't see it, and I don't think anybody else can either. Did the altar stone, which is one very strange stone, did it come from Milford Haven? The geologists have now shown that that's wrong. It probably came from the Brecon Beacons. And was this transport feat one of the greatest feats of Neolithic engineering? Probably not. There's just no evidence in support of it. Were the stones carefully placed and accurately chosen? Again, it doesn't look like it. And was the site of the monument ritually or scientifically auspicious? That again is speculation rather than fact. So let's just look at then what was the motive behind all of this. Now, the motive has been speculated upon at great length. One of the interesting things about the last 10 or 15 years has been the way in which the media has become heavily involved in the story of Stonehenge. And we do have groups of rather eminent professors these days and their research teams seeming to compete with one another for the wackiest possible story. So you've got the Smithsonian Institution is in there, the National Geographic magazine, BBC, ITV. They're all in there bidding for these wacky stories, and they're actually putting funding into research projects. And so we have a whole succession of crazy ideas that are coming forward, again, none of which seem to have any evidence in support of them. One of the latest ones is that the stones were sacred stones and that they were associated with healing springs in the Preselis, and that because these springs were sacred, therefore the rocks themselves were sacred, and therefore this gave them, the builders of Stonehenge, the motivation to go and collect these stones from Stonehenge, or from the Preselis, and to carry them all the way through to Stonehenge. In other words, they had sufficient motivation to want to actually undertake this mighty project. And then there's another idea, which is even more interesting, quite recently, that the stones are actually petrified ancestors, that there was a sort of ancestor cult, and that the stones were carefully chosen as an expression of the ancestor cult, and they were brought to Stonehenge more or less as totems or tribute stones. And now that's a rather interesting thought when you come to think of it. We've got another rather flat sort of stone here, flat stumpy one, Now that's probably great-grandmother Movanwi from Eglisuru, who was rather flat and probably just as wide as she was tall. And then we've got sort of great-grandfather David over there. He was 7 feet tall and rather thin. And one wonders, what is going through the minds of the people who are proposing some of these ideas. And then there's another idea that's been coming out recently, that some of the stones are male symbols and others are female symbols. I won't describe the shapes for you in any great detail, but the idea is that these stones alternate, that there are short stumpy stones and long thin ones alternating with one another all the way around the circle. Again, that's a piece of fantasy, and the reality actually doesn't do much to support that idea at all. But they're all competing with these wacky ideas, and one of the recent ones as well is that some guys from one of the British universities have been conducting acoustic tests within Stonehenge, and they've discovered that when they have a loudspeaker that's projecting sound across Stonehenge, the sound gets muffled by the fact that there are lots of stones in the way. Okay, big deal. And this was portrayed in the media as throwing incredible new light on the origins of Stonehenge, that this was a major breakthrough which was going to increase enormously our knowledge of what Stonehenge was actually for. So are they suggesting it was a sort of concert hall or what? Where they held rock concerts, or what was actually going on here? So if we look then at, just rushing on here, Merlin, the magic that was involved, and I've been wondering a lot as to where these stories, why is it so important that people believe these sort of things about Stonehenge? And if we go back right to the very earliest representations of Stonehenge, with this wonderful Welsh wizard called Merlin, the story was put about by Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 1100s, that Stonehenge was built by this magician called Merlin. He transported the stones miraculously from Ireland, from a mountain called Killarhouse in Ireland, and transported them to Stonehenge. And it's interesting that there was a very powerful political motive in the writing of this story. It was a novel, but what Geoffrey of Monmouth was trying to do was to portray or demonstrate the fact that that after the Norman takeover, the Norman colonization of England, that in fact wisdom resided in the East, in Ireland, and that there was this valuable link with Ireland. So he suggested that the stones had come all the way from Ireland. And then the latest myth, the myth of Herbert Thomas, as I say, which really didn't exist before 1920, his myth, I think, also arises from the fact that after the war, there was this huge sense of corporate desolation, national desolation. The state was in a terrible state of depression, and there was this great move to demonstrate that in Britain we had a superior civilization, the supremacy of man over nature, etc. All of these things, I think, underpinned Thomas's idea, the necessity of the idea of developing this human transport theory and showing that man was capable of incredible things, even back in the Neolithic. And so, just to finish off, what we've got at the moment, I think, is this absolutely unnecessary myth of the Immaculate Monument. It's manifested in many different ways. It is a hugely valuable monument, obviously. It's as I said at the beginning, it's an iconic structure. But it actually, do we need it to be that immaculate? Do we actually need to demonstrate that Stonehenge ever did exist in this immaculate form? Because the evidence actually seems to tell us otherwise. It simply seems to tell us that Stonehenge was an incredible idea. The aspirations and the ambition of the builders was absolutely phenomenal, and we have to admire them for that. But I suspect that, if truth be told, Stonehenge never was finished. It always was a rather shambolic old ruin, and it demonstrates, for me at any rate, that that people in the Neolithic were just as incompetent as they are today. I mean, I really don't think we have to. We need this vision of some ancient wisdom, some ancient lost skills, which we seem continuously, I think, to returning to this, and I don't fully understand why. So, as far as I'm concerned, Stonehenge is a shambolic old ruin, moderately interesting, but really, when it comes to the mechanisms of how Stonehenge was built, how the stones got from here to there, to my mind, the most wonderful thing about the whole story is that glaciers, which are incredible things, were responsible for most of the hard work, and that all mankind had to do at the end of the day was to pick up a few stones in the vicinity of Stonehenge, try to do something with them, and make the best of what was always a rather difficult job. Thank you. There I shall stop.